Sombra is one of the most misunderstood heroes in the game. Newer Sombra players fall into two extremes. They either play way too passive and try to break into the enemy from the front, or they keep going deep into the enemy backline regardless of what comps both teams are playing. To understand how Sombra should position, we must first understand this. Sombra, despite being a flanker, actually has quite a long range. Her maximum falloff is 35 meters, which is almost as much as McCree, and she has a more precise weapon than Tracer, which allows her to poke at mid-range better. Knowing this, how do you want to be positioned as Sombra? It depends on your comp as well as the enemy's comp. Suppose the enemy is playing a more brawly comp. You typically want to position closer to your supports at longer ranges. You should still be on an angle, preferably on high ground, but positioning at a shallower angle will allow your teammates to support you better. Positioning further away means that their close range threats can't do much to you. Remember, Sombra actually does quite a lot of damage at longer ranges, so don't worry about just safely poking out the enemy. You farm EMP faster when your teammates can help you, and you put out a lot more pressure when you're remaining outside the enemy's optimal range. Furthermore, brawly comps are typically good at peeling for each other, so being in the backline, at least in the beginning of fights, isn't that helpful. You might get a hack on a backline target, but it's hard to actually follow up on it, especially early into fights. However, as the fight progresses, the situation changes. Enemies start exhausting their resources, your team starts finding openings against the enemy, or you might just have EMP ready. When that happens, that's when you might consider taking a more aggressive position and playing more greedily. Generally, if your team is running a more brawly comp with close range heroes such as Winston, Tracer, and Reaper, you look to do this earlier into the fight as they will help you absorb the pressure from the enemy. For example, when playing the popular Reaper Sombra dive comp into each other, both Sombra players want to position themselves at a slight angle at the start of the fight. If you go too deep too early, it's easy for the enemy to force you to translocate out, which puts your team in a 5v6, which is obviously bad. On the other hand, it's okay to play deeper into the backline once your team has an advantage that they can push. As now, your team is actually looking for kills and taking a lot of the heat away from you. However, if your team is playing more long-range spam heroes, you want to be playing more passively until you have EMP, or your team has a big advantage. Now, let's say the enemy is playing a more spammy comp. In this case, you don't want to be playing the same as you would against a brawly comp. If you position too close to your backline, you're an easy and very visible target. And obviously, you don't want to play at longer ranges against a comp that excels at it. That's when you play more as a sneaky assassin. You want to be positioning closer, see enemy, and deeper into their backline. Against squishier long range heroes, you win in a close range duel, especially when you have support from your team. And by positioning deeper, you help split attention away from the rest of your team, which allows your team to play more aggressively and reduces the enemy's ability to get picks. Again, you do want to adapt your style depending on what the rest of the team is playing. If your team is playing a more brawly comp, you want to be playing almost like a dime store tracer, looking for dives with the rest of your team. But if your team's playing a more spammy comp, you want to help your team control the flanks and win duels. Try to punish anyone who is playing isolated from their team. You can still look for kills, but since your team is playing at longer ranges, you have to be more careful as it is easier for you to get forced out. Anyways, equipped with this knowledge, even you can become the next